Aristotle believed that the point of tragedy was to put on the stage the negative or more ferocious or more diabolical side of man, the non-dualist side of man, in order to overcome it. Because life is born in pain, dies in pain, and consists of quite a lot of pain during the intermediary stages between birth and death. And in order to overcome and face that, particularly in a stoical way, you needed to take up these negative emotions into yourself and have them purged, have them sublimated, to use a modern word. And the way that you purged them was by watching tragedy. This is why people have always liked to be entertained by watching unpleasant things. It's a characteristic of our species. And all genres like horror and all the rest of it rely upon the fact that people like to see conflict. They like to see contumaciousness. They like to see that which in other circumstances could be perceived as threatening. When the Puritans banned our theatre, when the English revolutionaries under Cromwell prevented theatre, yet allowed opera, throughout the period of the interregnum, one of the reasons that they did it was to prevent the prospect of indecency, which always comes, of pornography, if you like, which always comes not in a literal pornographic way, as would subsist today, but through watching scenes of violence, through watching scenes of transgression, through watching scenes of horror, and also watching scenes which are simulacra. In all faiths, in Orthodox Judaism, in certain forms of pretty restrictive Islam, and in what is called fundamental Christianity, there is the view that because God has created the world as it is, art is a blasphemous simulacrum in relation to this. Most of the people who follow these faiths have no desire to impose upon the arts at all particularly. But this idea that God made the world and therefore it is a blasphemy to add to that making, and that all art, even great art, particularly great art, takes away from the unmediated religious experience. This is why many of the Puritans, like Prynne and others, opposed the Elizabethan theatre and the Elizabethan stage, because the English people achieved an extraordinary thing during the Elizabethan and Jacobean stagecraft. They basically created something which is amongst the elite art that has ever been created on this planet. This small island and a nationality within it, England, produced material at that time which is comparable to the Greeks and is acknowledged by the whole world to be comparable to the Greeks. Shakespeare is the greatest of those that were produced at that time, but there were many others such as Marlowe and Ben Jonson and Middleton and Rowley and all of the others, Kidd and John Webster, the divine John Webster, who could only write tragedy, who could only write dark, treacly pieces like The Duchess of Malfi or The White Devil, could only write tragedy. The highest form, the most cathartic form, the most ennobling form, a form which isn't written today. Today we have soap operas. Today we have that which is on the tube of a night time, the television of a night time. It appears that the tragic urge is missing from Western life and from world civilization. And there is a quite neat fit with that, because the liberal era can only take tragedy if it's restorationalist. There's an enormous archival tradition at the moment whereby many of the great plays of the past are put on endlessly in state houses, financed by public money. One of the more amusing, in inverted commas, features is what's called racially blind casting. You can now have plays like Julius Caesar, for example, where a half of the cast is black. And yet there's not a single black character in Julius Caesar. This is done so that the audience is desensitised to the fact that that is truly the case. But also, it's done because there are an enormous number of talented performers who, if you only did restorationalist pieces, could not perform. Indeed, there's a lot of ideology that plays around the representation of these classic pieces because nothing is neutral and everything has to be presented in a particular way. There's an enormous amount of sort of abattoiral excess, what some call the proletarianisation of culture, where everything is reduced to its lowest common denominator. You see this in horror as a genre. 100 years ago, horror was Bram Stoker and was Wilkie Collins and this sort of thing. Now horror is Stephen King, and beneath Stephen King, and beneath Stephen King, and beneath Stephen King, and so on, and you get the message. So there's a degree to which a coarsening and an absence of refinement and a sort of abattoirial statement whereby the thing is given you neat is what goes on today, and which is on in every multiplex. Has anyone come across those Saw films? Saw 1 and Saw 2 and Saw 3, and there must be a fourth one, so there's Saw 4 and this sort of thing, which are sort of sadistic and abattoirial, although in a sense no one is being harmed because you're only dealing with puppets. There's an artistic theory that deals with that area called the theatre of cruelty by a surrealist in France in the middle of the 20th century called Antonin Artaud. And there's a degree to which this material is as cruel as Greek tragedy, is as cruel as Elizabethan tragedy, but there is no moral or evidential purpose for it to be so. There's no philosophical reason why it should be so. Therefore, the thing exists in and of itself. If you want that degree of abattoir and horror, you could go down to your local butcher's, go round the back and plunge your hands into the offal and into the meat and move them around and bring them up and have a sort of threnody in that sort of a way. But that's because culturally the thing wouldn't extend beyond that gesture. And that's what's going along with a lot of these pieces. Because if you are to make the brutality of life as it's transfigured in tragic art meaningful, you have to transcend those sorts of actions, or you have to have a vocabulary to transcend them. But the doctrine of transcendence is a religious doctrine, essentially, or is a psychosocial set of emotional and linguistic patterns which portends to religious belief, whether one has any religious belief or not. It means that one believes there are things above the things that face you, and there are things above that, and there are things above those things. And or at least there's the possibility that such might be the case. So you're looking upwards rather than looking downwards. This is why people go to tragedy and feel exhilarated afterwards rather than feeling depressed or out of sorts or mildly mentally deranged by the depiction of cruelty. It's because it occurs within the context of a spiritual revelation which is transcendent. But the whole purpose of this sort of culture that we live in today, as Evola and other thinkers have put it, is not to have transcendence at all. It's to keep man at a certain level, ultimately a level of consumption, the expulsion of energy, the repletion of energy, consumption of goods, depletion of the consumption of those goods, the need to consume even more of such goods. If you keep people at a certain level,